suggest we should start. So let me say welcome everyone, also in the name of my co-editors, Franziska Müller and David Chandler, to our roundtable and book launch event on teaching international relations in the Anthropocene. My name is Delf Rothe. I'm a researcher and lecturer at the Peace Institute for Peace Research and Security Policy at the University of Hamburg, and one of the co-editors of the new textbook. First of all, let me say thanks to the European International Studies Association, EISA, for hosting our event and for promoting it. And a special thanks go to Nyung, who is the association manager of EISA and who did a great job in organizing this event tonight. So big thanks to Nyung. Let me just briefly outline the program and make some technical announcements first. So first of all, David, Franziska, and I will say a few words about the textbook and how this whole book project came about and evolved. Secondly, we'll show you 3 short video inputs by authors who cannot be with us live tonight because they are probably sleeping or having breakfast because they are in other time zones. Following the videos, we will have a discussion with our panelists, which I will introduce in just a bit. And of course, we will then also open the floor and invite you to ask questions to our authors on the panel. So when you want to raise a question, please use the famous blue hand sign of Zoom. You will all be familiar with it. Or alternatively, you can also paste your question into the chat. One announcement on the chat: the general chat function has been disabled during the meeting to prevent misuse. I heard there had been some cases of a sort of misuse of the chat functions in previous EISA events. So the general chat is disabled, but you can use the chat function to write a question to Nyung, our host. So feel free to use that option, and she will then forward and send the question per direct message to me. As always, please make sure to mute your microphone when you're not speaking to avoid disturbances. And the final announcement would be that this event will be recorded and posted online by EISA on their YouTube channel, I guess. So if you don't want to appear in this recording, make sure to switch off your video. So as mentioned, just briefly, a few words on the background of the book project. It's the outcome of a long-standing cooperation between the 3 of us that grew out of a series of EISA events, actually. So we had a couple of EVIS workshops, European workshops on international studies, for example, on issues of complexity and global politics, on international relations in the Anthropocene in 2016, I think. And then we had the EISA section in Prague, 2018, on international relations in the Anthropocene, which has now become a semi-standing section for the next 3 years. And in the aftermath of the Prague conference, we were thinking about possible sort of publication outputs of that section. And then David came up with this idea of why not sort of putting together a textbook. And all 3 of us, Franziska, David, and I, had been teaching classes on international politics, security, global governance in the Anthropocene. And all of us had the feeling that while students are often quite enthusiastic about sort of this idea of the Anthropocene, they quite often found the existing literature quite challenging because it's very theory rich and heavy. So we thought it would be great to not publish another, special issue or collection of specialized chapters, but really a textbook that gives a comprehensive overview of the field in accessible sort of terms that is directed at advanced students and their lecturers. So the resulting textbooks contains 24 short chapters with didactic features, and is structured into 4 sections. And I will now hand over to David and Franziska, who will briefly walk you through the 4 sections. David, would you like to take over?
I promised myself that we're near the end of the whole coronavirus thing, and I would always unmute myself before I speak, but there you go. Next time. So the first 2 sections I'm going to talk about, and Franziska's going to talk about the second 2. The first section, the introductory section of the book, is titled The Anthropocene from the Global to the Planetary. And I think this is really the nub of the textbook and the nub of the problem of teaching the IR in the Anthropocene. I don't actually think that students have a trouble with thinking about Anthropocene international relations thematics. There's a whole range of them and they're all super exciting. I think it's a problem for staff who haven't really been trained in a sort of more contemporary way of thinking about the world. And speaking for myself as one of those people who wasn't at all trained to think about IR in a contemporary way, thinking about what it means to shift from a global to a planetary perspective, I think is really the most difficult thing. I find it quite easy to think about transformations in international relations from a classical international regime to global liberal imaginaries and human-centered approaches, human rights and global civil society and cosmopolitanism and those things. So those transformations of the 90s and the 2000s, that's pretty, you know, graspable. But when we sort of think of beyond international relations or where we are today, and we sort of say that sort of global, liberal, universalist imaginary that was so fundamental, so important, and seen as such a breakthrough and a revelation for the discipline, when we sort of say that that's sort of in trouble, and that for many different perspectives and frameworks, it's a rather sort of hubristic, reductionist, colonial, whether we're coming from a sort of race coloniality background or an issue around the environment and nature, or thinking about technology or thinking about contemporary theory, we tend to problematize that sort of global optimistic imaginary in different ways. And the key thing that I think this section focuses upon is the problem of the human nature divide. And I personally think that people find it difficult to take this, when we're teaching, we're taking responsibility for a discipline. We're not necessarily telling people what we think personally or normatively. People find it difficult to take responsibility for thinking about the problems and going beyond, or if it's possible or not, the human nature divide and what that means and how it works and how to teach it. And to my mind, that's really what the textbook is for. It's not so much for students, it's more different ways in which we can sort of manage thinking about things in quite a different way, and that we shouldn't necessarily feel defensive or awkward about those things. And extending that in terms of how we think about security and take away the ground from a lot of the certainties from international relations and key ways of thinking, key ways of posing binaries of insides and outs and what should be secured, what can we imagine as threats, and what does it mean to problematize those ways of thinking in ways that are also productive. It's not like this isn't relevant to policy making. It's not like it isn't relevant to students and their jobs and their careers. And it's just working those things through that we're trying to do collectively in this book as a beginning, a way of doing that. So thank you, Del.
Yeah, I'll move over to the second 2 sections of the book. And in the third section, we are wondering how forms of governance and political agency are changing in the context of the Anthropocene. Like, we wonder what does happen when we have new political actors beyond the nation states, as well as new forms of governing apart from top-down regulation. And Basil Bornemann reminds us of these processes and recaptures debates on reflexive governance. And also, other chapters in that section demonstrate that the means to address the challenges arising in the Anthropocene are limited. like Ayjem, as I guess she will point out later. She asks disturbing questions about what happens to democracy in the Anthropocene, and takes us on a journey into the future where we can wonder what the ruptures of to democracy may mean to us, and what kind of democracy we might imagine when facing challenges of the Anthropocene. And also, Erica Cudworth and Steve Hopton broaden our understanding of who qualifies as a legitimate actor in IR by addressing post-humanism and also multi-species relationality. Dalia Zimmermann challenges the universal perspective by referring to the regional repercussions the Anthropocene has for the Asia-Pacific region, like by colonial legacies that affect nature-society relations in that area specifically. And lastly, Stephanie Wakefield takes us on a journey to cities like New York and Miami that are currently experimenting with new forms of urban governance and especially urban experiments that may make it easier to prevent flooding and face the nature society changes that are happening on an urban level. Yeah, and in the last part of our book, we move on forward to questions of methodology and epistemology. And here in these contributions, we ask how we approach the Anthropocene condition. Because as David has already reminded us, social science research on the Anthropocene has to develop methodologies that move beyond the mere measuring, monitoring, or classifying, and they need to overcome the role of the researcher as a neutral and disengaged observer. And this calls for alternative approaches that extend the classical role of the researcher towards one that is situated and engages in the co-production of transdisciplinary knowledge. Here, Anna Leander explores the troubled relationship of IR with methodology and presents collaging as an approach to overcome this. And also Caitlin Ryan introduces community mapping as a way of knowledge production that deprivileges Eurocentric understandings of environmental change. And further contributions by Suvi Alt or Harshavardhan Bhatt go further into this direction by concentrating on the Anthropocene's temporalities and on alternative ontologies that follow the weather or the change of rainfall, as I'm sure Harsh will say in a minute or two. And lastly, also Isabella Herman concentrates on media depictions of the Anthropocene and especially of dystopias and utopias by focusing on science fiction cinema and how that may relate to the Anthropocene. So we end our book with a very broad range of very different ways of doing research in a new way and different forms of methodology, and remind IR to engage with these methodological questions in a much more intense way.
Great. Thanks, Franziska and David, for this brief overview of the 4 sections of the book. As promised, we have like 3 short, very short video inputs by 3 speakers who are abroad. The first video is by Dalia Zimmermann, who is an associate professor at the Graduate School of Humanities and Social Sciences at Hiroshima University in Japan, and is well known for contributions to debates on peace building and the local turn, and more recently on international relations in the Anthropocene. And Dalia has a chapter entitled The Asia Pacific in the Anthropocene. Nu, could you play the video?
Hi everyone, my name is Dalia Simangan and I'm speaking to you from Hiroshima University in Japan. I'm sorry that I cannot join you today, but I'm glad that I'm still able to share with you some of the key ideas of my chapter entitled Disrupting the Universality of the Anthropocene with Perspectives from the Asia Pacific. If the Anthropocene entails or perhaps even necessitates disruptions, why don't we also disrupt the universal narratives that silence marginalized voices about the disproportionate impact of the challenges in the Anthropocene? And that's what I aim to do in my chapter. to challenge the universalizing tendency of this concept and infuse it with discussions about the realities of injustices and inequalities, may they be in the past or at present, but still persist in our society. I'm from the Philippines, but I cannot speak for all the Asia Pacific countries. The Asia Pacific in itself is not homogeneous. If there's no single Asia Pacific story, what's more for a single Anthropocene story? But I aim to draw on narratives, at least from this part of the world, to pluralize our understanding of the causes, the consequences, and perhaps even the potential solutions to the challenges in this new geological age. So, in my chapter, I highlight the contribution of the Asia Pacific region to the conditions that created the Anthropocene, and I also discuss the socio-ecological consequences of colonization and intra-South inequalities, and how these consequences impact the capacity of many Asia-Pacific countries to adapt or to respond to the challenges in the Anthropocene. I also would like to add that inspired my research, but it also challenged me to approach my teaching in a way that considers the conceptual, temporal, and spatial scale of the Anthropocene. I teach United Nations peacebuilding cases and global governance, and these subjects, like the IR discipline, unfortunately, also have the tendency to be Western centric, anthropocentric, and biased in favor of this so called modern ontologies. This means that IR is not just a lens to understand problems, but it could also be one of the problems. So, teaching IR in the Anthropocene means teaching these inherent problems within our discipline and guiding my students to identify them so that they can, in the future, shape a discipline that is more responsive to historical injustices, that is more inclusive of non Western ontologies, and more attuned with our planet.
Thank you. So the second video input is by Matt Mcdonald, who is Associate Professor of International Relations at the University of Queensland in Brisbane. And you will probably know Matt from his works on climate change and security discourse, as well as securitization theory. And Matt's contribution is entitled Protecting the Vulnerable Towards an Ecological Approach of Security.
Everyone, my name is Matt Mcdonald. I'm a reader in international relations here in the School of Political Science and International Studies at the University of Queensland in Australia. And it was such a great opportunity to participate in this book project. Thanks to David, to Franz and Delph, and such a great opportunity to have conversations about some of these themes in wonderful places like Hamburg and Prague that now seem a very, very long way away from Australia in the context of the lockdown. My own chapter, my own contribution to this excellent volume on international relations and the Anthropocene focuses on the notion of ecological security in the context of the Anthropocene. And it does this through the title of the contributions, Protecting the Vulnerable. And there is an idea here that if we are really interested in protecting the most vulnerable in global politics, we need to orient towards thinking in more holistic terms about the preservation of ecosystems that will in turn enable the realization of life for and life prospects for not only the impoverished in other parts of the world now, but for future generations of humans and indeed for other living beings. And so that's the nature of my contribution. I begin by talking about why it's important to engage security, and this focuses on the idea that actually security is central to the reason for being and legitimacy of key institutions of global politics. And once we recognise that, and that these institutions do increasingly recognise that climate change or other environmental problems constitute security challenges, we do need to say, well, to what extent then are they actually doing their job of providing security in the context of the challenges we face? So there is a real logic behind engaging with security in this space. I then recognise that actually we do see lots of different discourses of security when it comes to an issue like climate change. So some focus on the territorial preservation of the nation state and the ways in which climate change might challenge that through displacing refugees who in turn try to come across the border, for example, to international security approaches that focus on stability and the importance of managing regional outbreaks of conflict associated with or exacerbated by climate change, to human security that focuses on the well-being of individuals. And ultimately make a case, as I do, for ecological security, which is about the resilience of ecosystems themselves. If we approach security in that way, especially in the context of something like climate change, then it provides us with resources for ensuring the protection of the most vulnerable in global politics. The Anthropocene context is such an important context for me for making this case, in part because it really does directly point to the inability for us to sustain this hard separation between humanity and nature, for example. We need to think in fundamental terms to address the climate crisis in particular. We need to think in fundamental terms about ourselves as part of sets of ecosystems, as part of the biosphere, rather than that as something out there from which we can protect or insulate ourselves from. There's always been a kind of hubris to that, it seems to me, and insufficient recognition that actually the functioning ecosystems provide the conditions in which life is possible in the first instance. In terms of teaching in the Anthropocene, it's certainly become more and more of a feature of the way I teach a course like Global Security. There's an excellent textbook on the market available on security broadly. When I first took over that course at UQ, it was called Strategic Studies. Then it was changed to International Security, and I changed it ultimately to Global Security. And that's part of this recognition that actually becoming harder and harder to think of security through the lens of how do these self-determined entities defend themselves from threats from the outside. We need to recognise that actually we create conditions of threat, but also we need to work together to address them. Thanks again for allowing me to be part of this project. It's been a pleasure contributing to it.
Great, and we'll have a third video input by Tamara Trounzel, who's an associate professor of international relations at the Universidad San Francisco de Quito in Ecuador. And Tamara has worked on pluralism and international relations, relational ontologies, and Andean philosophy, which is also the focus of her chapter with Jared Radekop, entitled Disrupting Anthropocentrism Through Relationality.
Hi, I'm Tammy Trounzel, and I'm delighted to celebrate the launch of international relations in the Anthropocene after such an incredible collective effort on behalf of the editors, authors, and publisher. My colleague Jared Redekop and I wrote a chapter entitled Disrupting Anthropocentrism Through Relationality. Since anthropocentrism is not the only way of conceiving of humans in relation to the epoch, planet, or cosmos, our first task in the chapter is to explain how this is possible. We rivet our focus on how the fundamental existential assumptions that we embrace give shape to how we engage existence and therefore perceive, understand, and respond to the environmental imbalances that we are experiencing now. Two possible assumptions are separation and interconnection, but separation by far is the most commonly embraced assumption. Its filter is so pervasively used that we accept its field of conceptual possibilities as the only one available. Besides undergirding most of what we do in academia, just calling the current era the Anthropocene relies on this primordial condition of existence to even become a conceptual possibility. Our chapter is dedicated to disrupting the very anthropocentric logic that leads us to calling it as such. To show how other logics come to be, though, we need to examine how other fundamental existential assumptions give shape to other ways of being, doing, sensing, and knowing in the world. The chapter includes the non-anthropocentric concepts of Runa and Aini from the Andes as a way to show, through the method of contrast, that they neither reflect nor lend themselves to a similar way of being and doing in the world. We've been asked to address how we engage these questions in the classroom. In these times of Zoom, both students and professors are spending more and more time on electronic devices. Not only does this tend to atrophy the physical body, but it also atrophies our ability to sense otherwise. Together, they narrow our capacity to engage complexity more fully. As such, in my classes, I am attentive to helping students do existential calisthenics as a way to start to build the foundations of ontological agility. One way in which I start to prepare the ground is by structuring all of my classes around multi-perspectivalism. Since my students are undergraduates who have only had the introductory IR course, I first expose them to many different theoretical perspectives and continually point out how the assumed ontological architecture makes those assertions possible. This exercise is only realizable when we have access to a different way of being, doing, thinking, sensing against which to contrast it, in which case I use the assumption of interconnection as the primordial condition of existence and the Andean principles that such an embrace affords. I work to continuously stretch students' imaginative capacity by showing how switching fundamental existential assumptions do not afford or bear the same kinds of fruit. As a result of these exercises, students learn to be more comfortable with being existentially stretched. To further counteract the atrophy of our senses, I offer a long-term extra credit project in my Contemporary IR Theories course, where students germinate a seed, plant it, and record its progress. While it is pitched as preparation for engaging with green theories at the end of the course, students seem to be more motivated by the generous extra credit option that initially seems fairly easy. Besides learning how to pay attention to a plant and figure out its needs, however, students are then asked to reflect upon how they conceive of this other. What personal beliefs surround the idea of how they understand and engage their relationship to the plant? How does communication take place between themselves and the sprouting plant? Are there other ways of communicating, of coexisting? Again, the goal is to help students first become aware of the contours of their own fishbowl as constituted through their embraced fundamental conditions of existence, and then point to other ontological possibilities to allow them to start experimenting with distinct ways of practicing existence, and to observe how each strategy allows for certain possibilities and not others. Besides being absolutely thrilled with the passion that the students start to show for gardening, I hope in this way to do my part in fostering the possibility of engendering a new era called the Runacene, or Runaceno, where we can begin to conceptualize and enact ourselves as a species in non-anthropocentric terms. For a deeper engagement with these issues, I invite you to check out our Chapter 24, Disrupting Anthropocentrism Through Relationality. Thank you.
Thanks, Tamara. Let me introduce our panel tonight. So we have 6 panelists who are authors in the book. The first is Franziska Müller, who is an assistant professor of political science at the University of Hamburg. And Franziska has worked on green governmentality, on RED+ and renewable energy transitions from a post and a decolonial perspective with a regional focus on sub-Saharan Africa. Our second speaker is David Chandler, professor of international relations at the University of Westminster. David is a prolific writer and has published several books on state and peace building, on the politics of resilience, and more recently onto politics and the Anthropocene. Our third speaker is Anna Leander, who is a professor of IR and political science at the Graduate Institute Geneva. And you will very likely know Anna Leander from her works in critical security studies and the commercialization of security in international political sociology, on visual politics or methodology. Next, we have Aisha Merritt, who is an associate senior lecturer at the Department of Political Science at Stockholm University, and Aisha Merritt's work focuses on discourses of democracy and the environment at transnational and global levels. I can tell you she's also one of the true experts on Laclauian discourse theory and the longtime contributor to the Earth System Governance Research Program. Next, we have Stephanie Wakefield, who is an urban geographer at Urban Studies Foundation Research and Urban Studies Foundation Research Fellow at Florida International University. And Stephanie Wakefield has published widely on discourses and practices of resilience and has developed the idea of living in the Anthropocene backloop, which is also the title of a recent book published with Open Humanities Press. And last but not least, we have Harshavardhan Bhatt, who is a doctoral researcher at the University of Westminster, and his doctoral research is an interdisciplinary study on the politics of the Monsoon. He's also a member of the Monsoon Assemblages project at the Department of Architecture at the University of Westminster, which has just organized a virtual exhibition called Monsoonal Multiplicities, and I think it's still online, so please check it out. I've got a first round of questions to all of our panelists before we open up the floor. And my first question goes to Franziska. Franziska, in your chapter, you kind of make the observation that some versions of the Anthropocene really reproduce an anthropocentric worldview around this idea of white men as planetary managers. So my question would be, how could more than human, more than cis male and non-white perspective change this dominant understanding of the Anthropocene? And how do we make sure that these perspectives get more space in IR classrooms?
Yeah, thank you, Delph. Yeah, good and very broad question. Well, what am I doing in my chapter? My aim was to bring together different perspectives to IR that come up with quite dissident ways of thinking and have the capacity to challenge and undermine several of IR's key truisms, like who qualifies as an actor, how the international system is structured, and also how nature society relations are perceived in an anthropocentric way. And I argue that these this kind of thought is still reflected in several of the Anthropocene's more hegemonial narratives. Like there is still the idea, well, we need to bring the Earth system under control again. We need to shift back the Earth on its geospatial way, like it should be. And the human powerlessness should be once again replaced by human power to change the ways things are and the ways in which we have caused harm to the planet since 1492. And in my piece I argue that, for instance, more than human perspectives would be able to replace the discipline's focus on interstate relations with a new sensitivity for interspecies relations and interspecies agency. Also, I wonder how queer feminist perspectives could decenter the white male subject at the heart of the discipline and would then come up with different ways of caring for the Earth's ecosystem and introducing the perspective of care in a more pronounced way. And also I engage with the several decolonial and settler colonial perspectives on the Anthropocene, which highlight that the Anthropocene is in fact nothing new, that for indigenous populations, like for example, Kyle White reminds us, the Anthropocene has been happening since 1492 and is for indigenous populations more a kind of post-apocalypse scenario that we are now experiencing, which then means that indigenous people have come up with their forms of wisdom how to deal with that kind of environmental and cultural catastrophe. Of course, I do not say just listen to indigenous peoples, because like David Chandler and Julian Wade have reminded us, this would mean a kind of cooptation of their thoughts and their experiences. But for me, these different dissident perspectives can yeah, take us to a more critical way of thinking, yeah, yeah, I think these different perspectives can help us to see how Anthropocene discourses are happening and how they're still driven by means of control, power, and domination, and replace this by a more critical views to hegemonies.
Thank you, Franziska. David, I think resilience. Yeah.
No. Stephanie has to go just before 8. Is it okay to put Stephanie second and then I'll go after Stephanie?
Yeah. No, it's gonna be fine, Steph. We can take your Q&A, and it's still 20 minutes to go. So I think it's no worries. But
Yep, continue.
yeah,
Sorry.
cool. So resilience, I think, has become a quite powerful concept when it comes to coping with uncertainty and sort of complex risks. And in your chapter, you kind of argue that the advent of the Anthropocene renders the idea of resilience promotion increasingly problematic or even impossible. So could you maybe elaborate on why is that? How would you sort of explain that to sort of your students, and what is the alternative, maybe?
Thanks, Delph. Yeah, so I sort of argued that, as I was sort of suggesting earlier, that in a shift between a global, liberal, universal problem-solving imaginary that we had in the 90s and the 2000s, beyond politics and left and right and communism, capitalism and states and interests, we could like really do stuff, solve everything from the climate change, development, democracy, peace. Everything was all going to be resolved. Resilience is a sort of sphere way of thinking of, maybe it's more difficult than that. Maybe it's not so easy, as we sort of confronted liberal universalism, confronted reality, the reality that we came to know as the Anthropocene. Resilience begins to say, actually, no, the world isn't like that, amenable for us to do what we want to. We have to begin to work with things rather than imagine that we're ruling over, against, or separate from them. So resilience was a nice space in which we welcomed the Anthropocene into our lives as a sort of a barrier, like a slowing down. And the weird thing is, once we came out at the end of that little transition and we were in the world of the planetary rather than, or in the world of the Anthropocene rather than the liberal global world, the problem is like, who, you know, what is being saved? What is the cost of saving things? And it sort of seemed to be that resilience very much celebrated marginal peripheral peoples with their non-modern knowledge and like syncopated skills of living on the edge of a crisis. And that was all sort of nice for some people, a bit icky for other people. And the idea was that in them doing this work, everyone else could just get on as normal in their producing and their consuming and stuff like that. And resilience could sort of like evade or slow those problems. In the Anthropocene, it's more like, no, it's more difficult to do that. You know, even the last gasps of modernity that tries to reject a sort of anthropocentric, top-down centralizing thing, even that's sort of problematized. And so that's what my chapter is about, how the how we begin to get clarity of a different era, a different epoch, and the consequences that has for our politics, for governing, for the way that we think about things. So yeah.
Yeah, thanks, David. Stephanie, I think your contribution kind of links up nicely with what David has just described, because in your chapter you sort of describe how cities that are vulnerable to environmental change, such as Miami or New York City, increasingly rely on sort of experimental forms of government to deal with threats like flooding. Maybe could you give us just a few examples of how that looks like, these forms of experimentation? And secondly, as you know, Hamburg is also coastal city. So if I wanted to do a class, maybe to study experimental forms of government here, would you have some ideas or suggestions how one could do that with sort of in such a class? That would be great.
Sure. Thank you guys, by the way, for inviting me to be part of the book. I don't do international relations per se. I am an urban geographer, but it was nice to have the opportunity to think about some of these questions in that context. Yeah, so the chapter that I contributed to the book looks at some of these experimental modalities of governing cities and existing forms of urban life amidst things like climate change, rising seas, hurricanes, and so on in the Anthropocene. And what I talk about in there a little bit, and what I have written about in other places as well, is the way in which sort of, as David put it, this idea of resilience as a mode of salvaging existing systems, existing socioeconomic systems, and so on, has been proceeding by sort of problematizing old approaches to urban government, old ontologies, old epistemologies, this idea of human hubris, this idea of the human nature divide, and so on and so forth, that there's been this big reproblematization of what urban governance mean and what it can and should mean. And so that we've seen as a result of this, the turn towards a new sort of hegemonic way of thinking in cities about urban governance, which is very similar to a lot of the Anthropocenic thinking that has become popular in recent years as well. This sort of says we need entangled human nature systems that sort of welcome the trouble of the Anthropocene, whether that trouble is, unstoppable flooding that just is going to become part of life, insecurity, living in coastal areas, so on and so forth, infrastructural fragility and so on. And that tries to turn cities into laboratories for experimentation with those new modalities of infrastructure. So it's really been, what I talk about in the chapter is that we've really seen the rise of experimentation and redefining urban infrastructure. And so we see, some of the examples that I mentioned there are the use of nature, living beings, natural systems as critical infrastructure systems, things like oysters along the coastlines of New York City, a very paradigmatic example of this living infrastructure approach that, welcomes floodwaters rather than blocking them out like a breakwater. It lets them in, but uses, the actual building of reefs on top of each other to mitigate them or to attenuate them. Or in Florida, one of the big Miami resilience projects is to restore the vast Everglades ecosystem and to use the pressure of that water to push back on salt water intruding into the urban drinking water supply. So, these are some amongst a lot of other examples we could point to of this reproblematizing of urban infrastructure. And, to me, I think it's interesting to see this shift in thinking, but I do find it one that is very conservative in many ways. It's an approach that really, proclaims itself to be innovative and radical and transformative, but it really is still putting all that experimentation and all that innovation toward preserving what is already there, existing urban systems and so on and so forth. And I don't, to be honest, know all that much about Hamburg's situation, but in my own teaching, in different cities, I primarily work with, like working class students, who, for whom the Anthropocene is a pretty easy concept to grasp, and one that immediately kind of points to things they've lived through. They're coming from Puerto Rico, they were in Maria, they were in New York, Sandy, these kinds of events, and the need to reinvent how they live, not just save the systems that are causing everything to be this way. And so one of the things that I do and I teach quite often is to try to sort of give them the tools to define what experimentation might mean in ways that are going beyond just salvage. One of the things that they talk about repeatedly when the Anthropocene comes up is that they actually feel very powerless, not the all-powerful human that is always, said to exist, but they feel that they actually need hubris. They need power, and they need to build power in order to actually have some say in what's happening and to determine the future rather than having it determined for them. So what we do a lot in class is work on skills, survival skills, technical skills, technical experimentation. We're restoring a water mill on my campus right now, and things like that. You know, how to build a fire and so on and so forth. And those sound just, you know, sort of not theoretically sexy, but they're actually, you know, the things that are demanded repeatedly by students. So I don't want to talk too long. I'll leave it there. But.
Thank you. Thanks, Stephanie. Super fascinating. Aishem, in your chapter, you sort of relate the Anthropocene concept to questions of democracy. So could you maybe please just tell us, how does, in your view, does the advent of the Anthropocene challenge existing forms of democracy? And then a second related question, in your conclusion, you provide some exercises to imagine alternative forms of democracy, which I think are really great. Could you maybe just describe what kind of questions such exercises could entail? Thanks.
Thank you, Delph, and thanks for organizing this event to everyone who is involved. It's great to be here from Stockholm. As you see, we are in summertime and it's still not completely dark outside, although it is almost 9 p.m. And it brings a certain set of concluding feelings towards the evening. What I have experienced when I was writing this chapter was not only so much summarizing what Franziska called disturbing questions that the Anthropocene poses to democracy, but also where can we go from here and how can we perhaps think with the students in the classroom to deal with these challenges. So in IR, we have ways of thinking about problems with democracy, and we have almost standard ways of answering those questions. And these concern transparency, accountability, inclusion, and so forth. What I try to do is to trace back from the view of an undergrad student where these ideas are coming from. And almost always these ideas come from a nation level idea of democracy, followed by an internationalization of these scales. So I wanted them to step by step question where these concepts are coming from, and they ended up becoming a list of questions, basically. Why do we feel so dependent on representation? Why do we feel that accountability and transparency can be sufficient conditions for global institutions to democratize themselves, and so forth? So that was the motivation, and it was also the to a large extent the contribution that the chapter made to my thinking, and I really enjoyed thinking in this fashion. And then what I also thought I would bring into this roundtable was when we're writing academic articles and when we're writing textbooks, we tend to think differently. When I was writing about scale and democracy in the Anthropocene, I was thinking a lot about the extent to which our previous conceptions of democracy were not going to be able to stand this scrutiny that the Anthropocene brings. Whereas if you're teaching, you can't begin there. So I also wanted to think as if I was learning international relations for the first time. And then how would I reflect on this idea of planetary level governance? How would I reflect on international relations, which is a bit of an earlier concept if you think about it. So for very young students, very early students, I think it can be very interesting to try to grasp things, not so historically, not as if, oh, we have to study 20 centuries of international relations theory, political theory, etc., but as what are we standing on at this point in time? What is the intersection of environmental crises and democratic wishes we might have? And what kind of democracy can we carry into the Anthropocene. So the exercises you asked about are very much about that. They basically ask the students, what do you see in democracy of today's world that you would like to take with you? What do you see that you would find negotiable? Maybe, maybe it doesn't have to be all about elections. And what would you like to bring in? What would a new way of looking at democracy with all these constraints of the Anthropocene can bring into our thinking? I hope that explains a little bit, and I'm looking forward to the Q&A.
Great. Thanks, Aisha. Anna, in your chapter, you introduced collaging as a methodological approach and a critical intervention in discourses on the Anthropocene. Maybe could you explain us a little bit about what such an approach would entail, and do you think collaging could be used in the classroom setting as well, as a method to make sense of international politics and the Anthropocene, maybe? Thanks.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks. It's an interesting discussion, and I'll try to keep it really short so we have some space for everyone else. But basically, just to say, so the reason I introduce it to answer that question and what I think it can actually do for you is to get at some of the issues we've been hearing. So of course, when people start, IR students or us start thinking about what would it mean to engage the Anthropocene as IR scholars, and have some kind of relationship to these studies and so on. We need to think about how we carve out that knowledge, and so that's methods like questions. And the reason I introduced the notion of collages is I think it allows you to do three things, very banally. It allows you to basically begin thinking about the co-production, or the role of IR scholars in producing the Anthropocene and different versions. So I really appreciated Tamara's videoed intervention there and her insistence on multi-perspectivalism. And I don't think we need to go to the Andes and the Runa to find that. I think we have it in the different conceptions of the Anthropocene. So thinking about collaging is basically a way, opens up for grappling with these different versions of what the Anthropocene is and what it means to think about planetary politics, as David has been saying throughout here. So that's one thing. So basically beginning to grapple with and working with the different versions and allowing of the heterogeneity and the multiplicity of these versions. The second thing, and I think this came out nicely now with Aisha, but it's come out again and again in the different presentations, is to problematize it. So I don't think we need to read Foucault to understand the importance of the way we pose a problem. And we've heard many people now say that, a core problem is that IR has given solutions and so on. So it problematizes the Anthropocene in a certain way, and therefore also comes up with certain ways of dealing with it. So thinking in terms of collaging is a way of allowing you, by putting together things that don't usually fit, thinking about different ways in which we might actually problematize this, if it is in terms of democracy and what it means in terms of thinking democracy or in terms of something else. So that's the second point. And the third point is the point about then making things with it. So maybe this is because I worked too many years in a business school. I'm not entirely sure. That's not a very glorious thing, of course, in critical context. I'm sure, by the way, I didn't say critical about the way I presented this, but in business school, of course, people always want to do things. And I think, when we produce knowledge, we tend to do things, and it's quite important. And I think collaging has a nice way of actually thinking about moving from the observation and statement of a problem and in some kind of way, and the politics of that. Most IR scholars are interested in some ways in politics, to thinking about how to what their interventions, understandings, etc., actually do, and maybe also thinking about engaging actively, not only with advising, but actually doing things themselves. So by working with also the material aesthetic side of things, actually engaging in building different kinds of worlds. And I think now Stephanie is gone, but usually experimental methods are all about that. So that brings me to so that's very briefly, I take a little bit more time on these points in that chapter, but very briefly on could you do this in the classroom? Yes, I actually, of course, like the whole point of, I think, when we think about how methods and what we're actually, ways of carving out knowledge or heuristic devices, so developing imagination in that and different forms of imagination and learning to work with different kinds of sources, I think actually is a very important part of what we should be doing in the classrooms. And I think we all try to in our own ways, and I certainly do. So, thanks.
Great, thank you, Anna. Harsh, in your chapter, you argue that the weather is not only sort of an epistemic object or an object of human intervention in the Anthropocene, but it's actually always a method. So I was wondering how can thinking with air and the weather enrich our understanding of IR in the Anthropocene? And sort of, could you give us maybe an idea of how interested students could do that, thinking with the weather, find their own stories, and yeah.
Yeah, thanks Dov, thanks Francisca and David for having me. I mean, the weather has always been a method for international relations. I think in a way, a lot of disciplines such as political science and and the social sciences has been the project of gaslighting what the weather is, and to produce certain kinds of weathers, to construct a certain kind of formation that can be worked through as the weather. So in my own work, for example, which is about the monsoon and the air of the monsoon, which is the greatest form of aqueous form held anywhere over land, which predominantly happens over the South Asian subcontinent, but over Southeast Asia. The monsoon becomes, through its history, a political construction of certain, regime of understanding what the weather is. So the weather is always a method. It is always already a method. It is not just because we are breathing beings, and not just because the environmental humanities and anthropology tell us so, but it's also because it is constantly a political. It's a construction, and so. Yeah, I mean, so that's one intuitive answer to it. But if you also I mean, I've had the opportunity I've had a few opportunities to engage with students on this subject, and once in an IR class, for example, where and David was, I think this was with David's class, where students are really able to bring in different forms of weathers into the classroom and see how it interacts, right? I mean, and pedagogically, there's a history in anthropology and and even, for example, with toolkits coming out with a variety of disciplines about, from embodiment, from the works on embodiment, works on indigeneity, and so on, which do this kind of thing. But I think there's much to be learned about how disciplines like international relations, which really think of them in themselves in very particular ways, are actually playing a hugely important role in constructing what the weather is, in teleological connections and scientific cosmologies, and the way they want you to perceive a certain kind of world. In a year of 2021, where science does not have the answer to the question as to why clouds form. So we don't know why it rains. We don't actually know why clouds form the way they do. But scientific cosmologies in international practice, in political science, political theory, and international relations are very particular about the affiliations they have with so-called scientific projects, not recognizing that science is diverse, science is place-based, science has context. And so I think there are many different cross-pollinations that are constantly involved in answering your question. And I think my chapter picks up three different literatures and does a very brief skimming sort of hand-holding exercise through bodies, thinking with people like Christina Sharp and some recent plantation studies work, for example, that has been coming up from the Americas. Thinking with aerosols that's connected to my own context, and thinking with the wind, and how a particular story emerges for the wind from my own circumstance and pedagogical circumstance, and how they become political constructions, how they become international relations, in a pretty normative yet theoretically nuanced way at the same time. So I hope that answers your question. Thanks.
Yeah, great stuff, Harsh. Many thanks. So we have still half an hour left, so I'd like to open the floor, and yeah, I'm ready to collect a few questions. Please use the hand icon, the blue hand sign, or you can also post your question into the chat to Nyung, and she will forward it to me.
Don't be shy.
Perhaps I can start with a question.
Sure, go ahead, please.
When is the book coming out? And I also wonder, when I was listening to Ash, I thought of what happened in the aftermath of Chernobyl and the extent to which we were all of a sudden so careful with which way the wind was blowing and what kind of international relations that made. Has been an intriguing point of view for me. I think it has become one of the points of reference in some IR scholars' work, probably my generation, because we're Chernobyl children. But I just wanted to ask, like, are there more moments like this in the Anthropocene when the weather emergencies are kind of occurring, and then all of a sudden your attention in international relations kind of comes together with your attention to weather events, which typically does not happen. Typically, these things are quite separated in the minds of, well, both news producers and IR scholars.
Yeah, but thanks, Aisha. Let me just briefly respond to the first question. So the publication is now scheduled for end of April, so 29th of April. And you can, or there's already a flyer, a discount flyer with a 20% discount. So if anyone is interested, please just send Franziska, David, or me a message, and we can send you the discount flyer. And then there is a second question by Jan.
Yeah, hi. Can you hear me? Yeah, great. So yeah, just a brief question. So thanks a lot for all these contributions, and I'm really looking forward to the book, because I really think that this addresses really an important issue: how to engage with this topic, and how to come to terms with the Anthropocene in IR classes. I think there are a lot of questions, but I would like to come back to this notion of the planetary, and kind of this, because for me it sounds like, okay, on the one hand we're struggling with this, and David has focused on that a bit more. We as IR scholars grew up with this idea of how to engage with state-focused work and state centrism and so on. And then on the other hand, now we have this category, and of course, Chakrabarti has kind of highlighted this idea of the planetary as a, not opposed to, but as a concurring concept to the globe. And to me, it still sounds sometimes as a binary, although I know you don't want to see it as a binary, or many don't want to see it as a binary. And I mean, there is a lot of research, I think, in between, like if we already, what usually IR scholars do, to go beyond IR, to look into other transnational or translocal networks. So I'd like to challenge you on and explain to me, like in a sense of being a first year IR scholar interested in the Anthropocene. So what is the promise of looking to the planetary as opposed to the globe? I'm sure there is something, and I'm also kind of convinced myself, but I'm not sure what it is. So be happy to hear your voices and your opinions on this.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you, Jan. If there are no further questions at the moment, I would give the speakers the chance to respond. Harsh, would you like to respond to Aijam's first question?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. I mean, I for one, don't work with radiation and I think stories of blast, for example. But I mean, if you'll allow me an anecdotal detour, you know, in recent years, there's been a lot of work on the death of the monsoon, and this is something I'm publishing on soon, hopefully as well. And the death of the monsoon is essentially work that comes from very particular atmospheric science circles and publications, you know, that research very particular trajectories, mathematical and modeling trajectories of what happens to, you know, the planetary with greenhouse gases and certain forms of acceleration. But the thing is, the monsoon has historically been a weather space where European mathematics, you know, and meteorological mathematics more specifically, which rely on things like the Navier-Stokes equation, completely collapse. They don't have the dimensions to forecast monsoons. So, you know, the forecasting mechanisms that are the basis in which many people, not just in this, you know, in this broader room, but also many theorists take for granted as the planetary, is a fabulation. It is a fabulation that is constantly being reconstructed. And so the possibility that the monsoon will die, the possibility that South Asians and, you know, Southeast Asians will die or migrate, which of course will happen I mean, with the climate crisis, but the death of the monsoon in particular as a climatological object is a complete speculation. And it is completely got to do with the way political scientists, political thinkers pick up these speculations and write the story of how the wind blows and whose stories do they want to listen to in particular about how the wind blows. At the same time, when you have also scientists from other parts of the world and other forms of academies and other disciplines, scientific disciplines, who are also arguing that, well, maybe we will see a different kind of monsoon. Maybe monsoonal winds don't blow the direction you have been telling us it has been blowing for 150 years. Maybe monsoonal confluences are more complicated than what you've been telling us. So I think there are these, I know it's a bit of a detour, but it's, I mean, it's one that constantly haunts me, for example, in the sense that what stories get political agencies about where the wind blows from, what matters does it pick, and how does it affect our weathers from their weathers? And I think that is very much a political question. So thanks.
Thank you. Who wants to respond to the question on the planetary? David? Yeah, go ahead.
I don't mind. Thanks for the question, Jan. So to me, it's like a field or a journey, the Anthropocene or the planetary. And maybe when we're thinking about pedagogy, binaries are not the end of the world. Sometimes they're heuristically sort of useful as a way for thinking. So it's a bit like the shift from the international to the global. On one level, you can teach it or present it as a sort of a binary opposite, but like from today's perspective or on another level, it's like there's nothing different at all going on. It's, you know, it's a very minor difference of scale rather than anything ontological. So, and I think it's the same with the planetary, and maybe initially, or for some people, depending on their predilections, it could be just the same as the global, adding more enabling and all those things, problem solving. Nothing wrong with that in itself, but to my mind, when we're teaching stuff, I think it's nicer to sort of use it in a broader way, to use contrast, distinctions, to get students to think about possibilities. And so I think it is possible to present like a binary, where the global is universalizing, it's sort of homogenizing, equalizing, including, and the planetary, I don't think we need to make it up. We can just read what people in our discipline and similar disciplines are talking about. It's a bit more about differentiations and pluriversality, and how differences make differences, a bit more immanence. So you can sort of tell different stories, and then you can think about what's at stake and how do these stories of the international, or what used to be the international, how do they make sense to us in different ways? And so that's what I love about teaching. It's not like politics where you just have one position and you go to war on everyone. It's like the rich variety, the whole world that's opened up after the end of the sort of world we had before. I think it's like a wonderful opportunity. And I mean, looking at the chapters in the book, you can just see such a diversity of approaches and themes. You know, that's personally what I like about it.
Thank you.
And anyone else who would like to respond to one of the questions? Still muted, Aisha.
Thank you. I think it's a very important question for the whole discipline, actually. If we think in terms of scaling up and down, it might not be regarded as the most radical move, but if we think in terms of what David just described, from a universalizing to more embracing the particularities kind of attitude in international relations, I think the Anthropocene also gives us an opportunity, and I'm one of the people who really kind of push towards the opportunity to rethink what we have carried with us. And I'm sure there can be many other opportunities in our lifetimes. After the pandemic, we will be able to reimagine things again, and we will reconstruct and rethink what we want to take with us. But when it comes to democracy and the challenges of democracy in the Anthropocene, which was the chapter I wrote, I think one of the things that are almost unthinkable to question is the democratic necessity in global governance. And that has not been re-questioned a lot. The extent to which we bring from ideals of ancient Greece, ideals of especially nation state level French Revolution and American Revolution ideals. And if the Anthropocene can give us a moment to stop and rethink some of these and actually get rid of some of the institutions that are no longer serving their purposes, from the Holocene to the Anthropocene, I think that would be a fantastic opportunity, both for the discipline and for, well, all Democrats. And the students have a much easier time grasping this than I think many of my colleagues, because when I ask them something about, for instance, what can't democracy solve, they have a variety of answers, and I really think that we should also do this in a much more co-learning and co-producing way, and rethink our conceptualizations of scale and democracy and nation state. Even what does it mean in the post-corona, post-Anthropocene world to reorganize governance? So that's something that I look forward to discussing in our future meetings.
Thanks, Aisha. There is a question in the audience from Farai Chivato.
Hi, yeah. Thanks. This has all been really interesting. I just wanted to ask everyone, I guess, on the question of how institutions of governance are engaging with the Anthropocene, because I know it's definitely touched on it a little bit, but it seems to me that there's most both states and global governance institutions rely on kind of modernist frameworks still with engaging with the Anthropocene. So when you're teaching with students, how do you kind of talk about the practicalities of engaging with the more, I guess, radical challenges like ontological challenges, etc., of the Anthropocene, when that's not making its way into the institutions of governance that we talk about in politics? Is it about looking to other places in society that are thinking and doing with the Anthropocene, or are there kind of spaces that I'm not aware of that are engaging with these conversations?
Thanks. Any further questions at the moment? Maybe I could just briefly add to that. Maybe I have a related question. I think in 2019, I think it was in 2019, the Munich Security Conference. So Angela Merkel gives her opening speech, and she begins with the Anthropocene. So she she describes kind of how this idea emerges, and then she goes through a variety of security challenges, and then she mentions that this is the stuff that the Munich Security Conference is talking about. So my question is maybe, so what does it make that when the generals are sort of taking up this idea, maybe it's not so revolutionary after all as David would like it to be. So and relatedly, when the chapters were written, I mean, we were in the pre-corona, pre-pandemic world. So what does the Anthropocene give us to make sense of the contemporary condition, maybe as well? Not too easy questions, I guess, but maybe someone has an idea. Thanks.
Delph, you're meant to be answering the questions.
I might say a few things regarding the question on governance and institutions. I mean, I totally subscribe to the point that very often the governance answers that we find relate very much to the modernist and control-driven ways to re-regulate and regain control over the Earth system. And when I'm teaching, I think it's one of my aims is to sensitize the students for these developments, like to what extent can we see governance shifting to a permanent catastrophe modus, and what does that mean for democratic relations or for the ways in which society and parliaments interact with each other, which is of course something that we can see now very clearly in Corona times, but we hadn't seen this when we had been preparing the chapters since 2018. And I mean, for me, it's very important to come up with examples of basic and grassroots democracy and how these are may also be able to govern anthropocentric events like ecological catastrophes and what I mean. And I always come up with one example, which is already 800 years old, the waterschappen, which are councils for local dike and dam control in the Netherlands, and these exist since 800 years, and which means it's a very stable system to publicly control floods and protect society from that. So for me, it's important to come up with very concrete examples to allow learning on governance. Also, I focus a lot on the roles of cities in the Anthropocene, which also makes it easier for the students to relate to their own city, which is in that case the city of Hamburg, which may also be subject to heavy flood in the next decades to come. And so we also refer a lot to the things that Stephanie Wakefield has already told us about urban experimentation. And I think this put together can be a good framework that allows students to get a clearer view on how governance responses to the Anthropocene look like and what potential alternatives could be.
David?
It would have been wonderful
No.
to ask whether the urban experimentation would include this 15th century phenomenon. Just to give a brief anecdote, when I moved to Amsterdam as a PhD student, one of the first letters that I have received from the municipality was that you now have the right to vote in the elections of this water board, which I just couldn't relate to because, you know, I'm not a citizen, I'm not even yet a resident, I'm just becoming one. And that all of a sudden gave me such a feeling of being a part of the place that I think it really connected on the one hand, my perceptions of risk and the possibilities of flooding and so forth. On the other hand, it did give me this sentiment of, yeah, I'm belonging here now all of a sudden. It was a very transformative experience for someone who studies both the environment and democracy. But also I think we will find ways of experimentation much more in the governance institutions and also in the democratic fields, as are happening with participatory budgeting practices in urban scale, as are happening in carbon reduction principles that people are discussing on various fronts. And I think it is just a fantastic time to be an international relations scholar and to go about looking at how the society is going to try to transform itself, because at least in much of Sweden, this is a very hotly debated issue. And I think my colleague Nagme Nasseritusi would be able to tell you much more about this whenever she has the time and we invite her to contribute at some point. But the fact that we're trying to reduce carbon emissions, both at the global level and with nation and local level budgeting practices and so forth, is a very experimental take on global governance.
David, would you like to add something? You raised your hand.
Okay. So to me, I wouldn't take it so literally. I think it's more like a paradigm or a lens or a set of sensitivities. So it's a bit like when we move from like international to global, people had like you know, it's a global thing, states can't do this, and other people will say no, but states still can do this. And there was like a debate and there was different paradigms. So maybe similarly to today, say like coronavirus or whatever example you might want to take, some people might have a very state-based view of like, let's protect the vaccine and not export it. Other people may have a more global view of science and wonderfulness. And other people may be a more Anthropocene sensibility of like, this really shows some of the dangers in how we relate to nature, how we're like undermining different spaces and separations, how we need to take more care in different ways and work on how we produce and consume it and stuff. And so you can just sort of see that there's like a debate, and it's a bit like with IR, realism, liberalism, constructivism. We can just sort of bring in a more contemporary, I would just do like international, global, planetary, and say, these are the ways in which things are framed. And then it seems that there is a trend towards this sort of more planetary Anthropocene set of sensitivities. I think that makes sense in teaching. I know Harsh wants to come in.
Harsh?
I mean, Farai's question, I mean, it really, I mean, I feel this as both a student and somebody who's finishing just about to complete a PhD. And I'm wondering, if somebody gave me money, a fantasy money for an XYZ climate studies, for a, political studies project. And if there were students involved, I mean, and this is something this is also connected to conversations we had earlier, with engagements back home in India, for example, with conversations in Delhi, and Bangalore in the south, there seems to be absolutely no pedagogical, epistemological, or methodological avenue that is doing Monsoon studies or international relations, that is listening to the Anthropocene and careful about this, that is not in allyship with the death drive. They are all contributing towards the death drive. They're all invested in making things worse. In my 4 years of research, the only two positive stories I've found are to do with two communities in drought-stricken regions who decided to construct their own well program, and that basically came out of drought. And that had nothing to do with the government. That had absolutely nothing to do with governance regimes. And so in a way, the construct of governance and the ability for students to get jobs, the ability to be part of this economy, is somehow deeply invested in deepening the Anthropocene, in actually in widening that condition and profiting from it as much as it can while it is alive. So I think the crisis, therefore, is what is off pedagogical use. And I think that there are some questions around that circulation that only the weather can answer, that only people working with weather to literally drink water, to literally enable things to live, can answer. Because I don't know, sitting in North London, for example, right next to the Walthamstow wetlands, which provides 1/3 of London's water, I'm in no circumstance, for example, to even pedagogically answer that, because I'm invested in that death drive at this moment. So it's, so the whole question of governance is, anyway, thanks.
Thank you. One final question.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
So it's not a question. It's maybe just an idea. So coming back to the question of like how institutional frameworks involved with the topic of the Anthropocene and so on, it's actually an example from David's class in which we discussed the Human Development Report of 2020. So the UNDP, which involves and engages with the Anthropocene and so on. So I feel like we see institutions, and specifically international institutions, engaging with like contemporary debates, but the way in which they engage might be problematic. So how do we make sure that, like in a post-anthropocenic world, we will have a different understanding of the human nature divide and so on? So I feel like institutional frameworks pick up on the idea of the Anthropocene, but the way in which they portray this idea, it's problematic. So that's just what I think.
Thanks. That's a great point, and also perfect answer to my question about the Munich Security Conference, I guess. So yeah, great point. And I think we're at the end. So let me thank again our panelists and speakers. So give them the virtual applause, and thanks to all the authors who are also here tonight, and thanks to you in the audience for being with us. And yeah, have a great evening and see you soon.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you.